Hello, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you. I'm Megan Roberts, Director of Policy Planning at the United Nations Foundation, and I'm so delighted to be moderating this event to launch the World Benchmarking Alliance's Digital Inclusion Benchmark. Our conversation today is co-hosted by the World Benchmarking Alliance and the United Nations Foundation. UNF is a proud founding partner of WBA, and we know its work is really transformational for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. And we're here today to discuss how governments, companies, and investors can all work together to leverage the data and the findings from the Digital Inclusion Benchmark to accelerate and drive inclusive digital transformation, which we know will be key for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. And as all of you know, this work really couldn't be more timely. This year has revealed not only the central role of digital technologies in all of our lives, as so much of daily life has moved online, it's also underscored the universal role across the Sustainable Development Goals, from healthcare to education to employment, to name only a few. And this year has shown us something that we did already know, that the global digital transformation is unfolding unevenly, and it's demonstrated the costs of an unequal world. And it's reminded us that leaving no one behind, which is a central commitment of the Sustainable Development Goals, means leaving no one offline. In short, we face a real challenge, but also an incredible opportunity to create a digital transformation that includes everyone. A few quick housekeeping notes for our discussion today. Our event is on the record, and as you can see, it's being recorded, and it will be posted online afterwards. You should all be on mute, but please just be sure to remain on mute throughout the event. But I want to emphasize that we do really want to hear from all of you. We want to hear your reactions, your questions, and your thoughts on how you may be using the benchmark going forward. So please use the chat box in Zoom to ask any questions of the Digital Inclusion Benchmark team, or to share with us how the benchmark will help you in your own work. When you do so, just please be sure to share with both panelists and attendees so that everyone can see and respond to your thoughts and comments. And finally, please join the conversation on social media by using the hashtags that you should see in the chat shortly. They include hashtag DIB2020, hashtag Digital Inclusion Benchmark, and hashtag Tech for Good. Just a very quick note on how we'll use our time today. We will soon hear opening remarks from our distinguished speaker, which will be followed by an overview of the Digital Inclusion Benchmark's 2020 results and key findings. And then we'll be joined by a panel to discuss the benchmark's findings and next steps. So we have a really packed agenda for you today. And with the housekeeping out of the way, I'm really delighted to introduce our opening speaker, United Nations Undersecretary General and Special Advisor, Fabrizio Hochschild-Drummond. Many of you will be familiar with USG Hochschild's role in the UN's path-breaking work on digital cooperation. So we're delighted to have him here today to talk about how the WBA's Digital Inclusion Benchmark relates to the UN's own work in realizing an inclusive digital future. So Undersecretary General, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Megan, and warm greetings to all of you. I hope everybody is well and in good health. As Megan indicated in her introductory remarks, COVID has really accelerated a pre-existing process towards greater digitalization, in which we become more and more dependent on digital technologies for our work lives, for our private lives, for access to health and other very basic services. Those benefits often can make us overlook what Megan alluded to, that still half the world does not enjoy those benefits. And more, as part of the world becomes digitally dependent, those who are not connected are not just left behind or don't just forgo a luxury. They're pushed onto another planet with less and less chance of catching up. And digital doesn't become an add-on. Digital and the absence of it becomes a critical factor in meeting just about all other SDGs. Against this backdrop, in June this year, the Secretary General launched the Roadmap for Digital Cooperation, which was based on very extensive multi-stakeholder discussions and on the report of a previous high-level panel that we were pleased to partner with UNF to get underway. The roadmap sets out the path to connect everyone by 2030 and to try and seek to ensure that such connection not only happens, but that it's safe from a human rights perspective, and that it addresses vulnerabilities of those online and curtails harms and security threats. The roadmap sets out 8 targets through which this can be achieved. Now, when we talk about the overall digital divide, what I think often isn't adequately paid attention to is that that divide mirrors and more amplifies pre-existing patterns of exclusion. The divide is not arbitrary. The divide does not affect all equally. The divide pushes those who are already at the margins of the society further beyond the wall of acceptable standards of access to development and other opportunities. Just to take one example, the example of gender. 3 countries, men are more likely to use the internet than women, and that gap is growing. That means that for women, there are far fewer opportunities to learn, to work, to access healthcare, to use mobile money, or to find critical information that is a precondition to having any chance of becoming more equal in terms of opportunities. And what's true of women is true of just about all other vulnerable groups when it comes to connectivity. But as we're building back now, after COVID, and hopefully a large part of that building back will be building back digitally, we do have, as Megan alluded to, a unique opportunity to address some of these inequalities. And we must ensure that technological progress does not deepen existing inequalities. And it's very clear that we cannot leave that to the invisible hand of the market, because the invisible hand of the market has done an excellent job in ensuring those of us who can afford it are connected and those who cannot afford it are not. And that it has also ensured that the gap grows ever larger. So it needs ever more public policy. Now, it's relatively easy to advocate for a more inclusive digital world, but turning such words into action and practical policies is more difficult. But even before we talk about what should be done, we need to be able to measure progress and where we're falling short. And that's why the roadmap of the Secretary General called for the urgent development of better metrics for digital inclusion and literacy. Without measurable definitions, it's very difficult to address where best to use resources and to measure how we're progressing. And this is where I think the work of the World Benchmark Alliance is so important. Its benchmarking of technology companies is a hugely valuable contribution to essential efforts to make sure that everyone everywhere can access and use the internet meaningfully by supporting companies in identifying where they need to make progress on inclusion in very concrete and measurable terms. This benchmarking is an example of how digital inclusion, in fact, can be measured, looking at 100 pivotal tech companies with 16 indicators under 4 measurement areas: access, skills, use, and innovation. And these metrics provide a framework to compare the depth and width of digital inclusion. Rather than just the ranking of the companies, what I think is particularly valuable is the methodology and the process by which it was done. And it's also very heartening to know that so many companies work closely with the World Benchmark Alliance to develop these metrics matrices and measurements, sharing details of how they worked. And that sort of partnership is key with tech companies. I think now we need to expand this further, and we also need to recognize that tech companies are making important efforts and did during COVID. That the offering of free data or establishing mobile networks in emergency field hospitals or free access to educational platforms and contents are some examples of what we saw during the virus. And I think post-virus, not least, and forgive me a little bit of humor here, with the massive profits that have been accumulated, hopefully such programs can be greatly expanded. No, and this is not an unimportant point. Companies, and there's much research on this, more and more there's an expectation of the public that the focus can not only be on profits, and that there has to be greater focus on ethics, inclusion, and environment. And that in turn inspires trust of the public, what in turn is necessary for any business model. Research shows that there's a new generation of consumers. According to a study by Facebook, 68% of people between the ages of 18 and 24 express brands to contribute to society. And another study on Gen Z in the US notes that 90% of that generation believe companies need to take action on social and environmental issues. We are all, and this is true of the UN too, being held ever more accountable for our actions to contribute to building a better, more sustainable and more inclusive world. And there's also research that shows growing more inclusive is, in fact, can make companies more profitable. So it's potentially an advantage both ways. However, as this index shows, despite this evidence, there's still a long way to go. The digital inclusion benchmarking found that just over half of the companies had digital initiatives specifically targeted women and girls, just over half. So that means just under half didn't. And there are many ways that companies still can do more to include women and girls. When I was preparing for this speech, I was struck by a statistic. In the tech sector, according to this benchmark, about 25% of the work is made up. That is the equivalent to what was last seen in the US labor force in the 30s. So the tech sector, this 21st or 22nd sector industry, is at about the same status that the US labor market was about almost 90 years ago. That should surely give us pause for thought and how far there still is to go when it comes to inclusion. Another rather scary finding is that according to the benchmarking, only 16 companies have an explicit high-level statement on child digital safety. The vast majority are telecommunications services providers, with hardware and IT services companies lagging behind. The benchmarking also found that only 23% of digital companies cooperate with international or national authorities to report online child abuse. It's thus no wonder that the people who have benefited disproportionately at a more rapid rate than the spread of internet itself is those who profit from child pornography and child abuse. And this has been well documented by UN entities and by independent examinations. This sort of laissez-faire approach simply does not protect the public good. And there's a massive opportunity here for digital companies to step up action and to demonstrate their commitment to child online safety through more active engagement in creating safer online spaces. Ultimately, it's through open and constructive partnerships, self-reflection, self-criticism, and seeking space for improvement that we can collectively make progress better. This report is full of wonderful examples of companies taking action. We just have to scale up these actions and come together better. If we truly wish to create a more inclusive digital space, we need information, we need metrics, we need frameworks we can follow. We don't even yet have a universal definition for digital inclusion. Without standards or goals, it's much more difficult to improve. The World's Benchmarking Alliance's work, particularly the methodology, thought and partnerships involved, is a massive contribution. And we look forward to working with you to hopefully scale up and get the same approach across the whole sector to better ensure that the promise of digital technology is not something betrayed by our generation, but that we can use it to really enhance our ability to reduce inequality and to promote all of the Sustainable Development Goals.
Thank you so much, Undersecretary General. We could not have had a better voice to kick off our discussion today and help us understand the stakes, the opportunity that we face, and really that emphasis on measurement and on scaling action. So thank you again for your time and for joining us. And it sets us up so well for our next speaker. I am now really delighted to introduce Lourdes Montenegro, who I'm sure many of you know. Lourdes is the lead of digital sector transformation at the World Benchmarking Alliance, and she's going to share with us an overview of the results and the findings of the new digital inclusion benchmark. I've been privileged to know Lourdes and see her dedication in leading this work over the past 2 years, along with the excellent WBA team. So it's so exciting to have the results unveiled here today. So Lourdes, please, over to you.
Thank you, Megan. Allow me just a few moments to share my screen. And I'm very happy to be here tonight, for us in Amsterdam. But just like to say good morning as well to the other side of the world, Your Excellencies, our WBA allies, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for taking the time to join us as we finally, drumroll please, unveil the results of the first ever corporate and global benchmark that assesses the digital sector on the good that they are doing, especially in terms of digital inclusion. So before I go right into the results, I'd like to first speak to our work at WBA in general, because our work on the digital sector is only part of our broader work. The WBA, the World Benchmarking Alliance, is a global initiative that focuses on incentivizing corporate efforts towards sustainable development, and especially towards the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals. And we believe that one very effective way to do that is to encourage competition, race to the top, and make that race to the top for the social good. So we begin as for our inspiration for what changes need to be made. We begin with the Sustainable Development Goals, but we see that it's necessary to transform whole systems in order to achieve those Sustainable Development Goals. We try to look at which industries, which sectors, which companies are most impactful towards transforming the systems in which they operate, closest to their own business, identify them, develop methodologies, benchmark, together with our stakeholders, develop those methodologies as well. And the data is there as a public good that we hope will empower everyone, whether they are investors, both within our alliance and outside the alliance, whether they are governments, civil society organizations, and most especially the companies themselves. And finally, reach and create a better world through that positive race to the top. So that's our basic primary work at the World Benchmarking Alliance. We are now in the thick of developing benchmarks for all the different, what we call the 7 systems that need to be transformed. So you see food and agriculture this December as well, they are releasing big baseline report for 350 companies. We have the decarbonization and energy, which looks at climate contributions of the energy, automotive and utility sector. We have the urban sector. We have circular for closed loop manufacturing and contribution of companies to preservation of nature. We, of course, today our focus is on digital, but at the core of all these transformations is a social transformation. And next year we will be unveiling the results for 1,000 companies in 2021. And we will also be starting the work on the financial system. So without which we cannot enable all these positive transformations. We need the investors, the financial institutions, the banks, asset managers, and asset owners to be on board as well. So they will also be benchmarked. So that should also be exciting. Watch out for that. So the WBA ranks and scores assesses 2,000 companies. We call them the SDG 2000. They cover a broad spectrum of industries and countries, and they are the most influential for humanity to achieve its sustainable development goals. And our work is kept free and public. We operate as a public good through the support of our donors. We also recognize, of course, that data is just data unless it is being used and mobilized. So we are building a movement. Right now, we have over 180 allies, many of which are civil society organizations, but also a large number are financial institutions. For a full list of these allies, please feel free to visit our website. And if you yourself belong to an organization who is interested in joining the movement, in creating pressure and change for the corporate sector to contribute to sustainable development, please be in touch and join us. I suppose Undersecretary General himself, Fabrizio Hochschild, has already provided excellently for the context of why we are doing this work. The pandemic, I think, in the end, has made digital inclusion personal for all of us. We've seen how it affects our lives. We've seen how we become so dependent on technology itself to communicate, to stay in touch, for our healthcare, for our education. We become digital creatures in a way. Unfortunately, with that accelerated digitalization, there's a lot of danger. If we leave a lot of people behind, if technology itself is not worthy of our trust, if the system is broken and insecure. So we need a lot of work, not just to celebrate technology itself, to celebrate accelerated digitalization. We need increased accountability. We need increased constant vigilance over the trajectory of the digital sector. So that's basically the whole purpose of the digital inclusion benchmark. It's the first ever benchmark that looks at corporate performance on digital inclusion. By 2023, it will track 200 digital technology companies, and it covers 4 measurement areas. So what's very important to understand here is the idea of digital inclusion as something being broad and actually something being comprehensive. So when we talk about inclusion, it's not just access. That is the basis for inclusion, to enhance universal access to digital technologies. Connectivity is, of course, at the heart of that. But it goes beyond that. We need to improve all levels of digital skills. We need to ensure that trust does not become a barrier, and we foster trustworthy use by mitigating risks and harms. And finally, that we remember that it's all about democratizing participation in the digital economy, and that includes benefiting from innovation and being able to innovate. So inclusion also involves open, inclusive, and ethical innovation. So the benchmark assesses companies on 16 indicators across these 4 measurement areas, 4 indicators for each of these 4 measurement areas: access, skills, use, and innovation. And essentially what it does is it tracks how companies are helping advance a more inclusive digital economy and society. Who are these companies? For 2020, we call them the DIB 100. They are the companies who are the most powerful, the most influential on the structure and function of the digital system. In 2019, their revenues were more than 3 trillion, employ more than 8 million people. 7 of them were privately held and 15 with state ownership. They vary widely across the digital sector. We have hardware companies from semiconductors to network equipment manufacturers. We have the telecommunication services. And finally, we have the software and IT platforms, many of which are the online platform brands that we are very familiar with and use every day. All these companies have global reach, whether through their headquarters and through their various subsidiaries all over the world. They impact everyone all over the world, more or less. And this is the breakdown of these companies. So we see and we notice also a pattern in that breakdown. We have assigned a region specifically to China and the United States for the large concentration of companies coming from those 2 countries. So then we also have Asia, excluding China. We have Europe and everyone else. So others include Africa as well as Latin America. So now we're live. Very happy to unveil who have been leading the benchmark through a year of research and engagement with different stakeholders and especially with companies. So we are seeing diversity in the global top 10. So we have an Australian company at the top and a Korean company also within the top 10. So they're all from different regions, from Asia, from Europe, from the United States. However, we do notice something is missing from the top 10, and that's a specific industry, and that's software and IT services. So what we are finding in this benchmark, and which is very different perhaps, and very interestingly different from other, shall we say, normal ESG data, is that it's not all about size. So for example, Amazon, which is #1 in revenue, over 280 billion, is in the bottom half of the benchmark. So there's no correlation with size. So if you're a company, that gives you hope, because it means that just because you're small does not mean you cannot make a difference. You cannot have the impact on digital inclusion. But it also gives us some alarming signals. It tells us, well, it's what Spider-Man said, you know, with power comes responsibility. I would say with more revenues also come more responsibility. So this is a challenge for the bigger companies in the digital sector to actually step up their digital inclusion game. Look at what they're doing, look at their operations, look at their outreach, look at their commitments, and see what they're doing and whether they have truly embraced digital inclusion as a core responsibility of their business. All the 100 companies are, there's still a long way to go. So it's 35%. That's the average score for all 100 companies. One of the main findings, as we've said already, is that we're finding that the software and IT service part of the digital sector really need to do some adulting. This is really serious need for adulting. So we always talk about growth stocks. We always talk about growing, and these are the growth industries, and we're obsessed with growth by all means. But what we need to be obsessed about is not just growth, but growing up. So there's a part of the sector, of the digital sector, that actually needs to grow up, because their performance is really lagging extremely behind other sectors. So we're seeing, for example, telecommunications outperforming, hardware as well. They're close to each other, but software and IT services are not. And we think that this really has something to do with age, with maturity. The top 10 average age is around a quarter of a century, 75 years. They've been around, they've grown up, they become adults, and they become, in the process, responsible corporate citizens. They understand their impacts. So I think that's a very important call to action for the youngest part of the digital sector. Sorry. We also find that there's a need for clear and consistent support for digital skills. So of the 4 measurement areas, we're seeing that companies are doing the least in digital skills. And when we're saying doing the least, it means that efforts are not as consistent, that there need to be serious evaluation of the impacts of what they're doing, better transparency of their own contribution and the beneficiaries of their programs. So skills really need a lot of work, shall we say, especially for women and girls. So there's a lot of opportunities to work on programs that improve digital skills for women and girls. Another key finding that we found from the benchmark data was that, and this is one of the alarming findings as well, that ethics require an urgent update to match the digital era. Very few of the companies in the benchmark actually follow, adopt, or develop an ethics policy for artificial intelligence. So there might be an ethics policy somewhere. Half of the companies do have some kind of senior level oversight over ethics, but the issues are good. They talk about harassment, they talk about corruption, but for the digital sector, that is not enough. And now a lot of the ethical issues has to do with the way technologies are being developed, and that's where a lot of the risks lie as well. So it's very important to update and really look at the consequences of how technology is being developed and try to mitigate and understand whether it's actually good to embrace a certain technology or it's not good for humanity itself. Another key finding that has already been mentioned and is also quite alarming is child online safety. Only 16 of the companies in the benchmark out of 100 have made a very high level commitment to child online protection. It does not even require that. It just means that at a very high level in the company, they have committed themselves to making sure that children are kept safe online. And yet we only see 16 companies who actually have very clear commitments. So again, that's quite alarming because we know the scale of the problem. We know the children are some of the most vulnerable users of digital technologies, one of the most neglected as well. We forget that they are often the first adopters, yet there's not much done. And finally, what we are finding is that leading companies, global leadership, global best practice means that you have to stay ahead of the regulatory curve. So it's not enough to say we're just complying. It's not enough to just comply. You actually have to, if you want to foresee your risk, you have to stay ahead of the regulatory curve. So we're seeing this, for example, in a lot of privacy policies. It has been a challenge to apply the privacy indicator to many of these large companies. We're seeing a lot of variation in privacy policies across different subsidiaries and jurisdictions when there's an opportunity to actually have a broader approach to the problem that looks at that takes a very principled approach to the issue. So it's really about, if a leading company is really about staying ahead of the regulatory curve. So I end there with our call to action. I invite everyone to please explore the results, download the results, share the data and the findings, adopt the methodology. Is free for your use. If you're a smaller company or an SME in the digital sector, the methodology is there. You can use it to examine your own processes and operations. Get in touch with us if you have further questions on social media. Share using the hashtag DIB2020. Again, if you're a company, there's a challenge for you to coordinate and harmonize your actions to accelerate digital inclusion by joining the benchmarking journey. I could say proudly that over 50 of the 100 companies have been actively engaged and participated in the benchmarking process, but we're missing the other half. So engagement is the start of the journey of showing responsibility, of embracing digital inclusion as a core responsibility of the digital sector. The other is the other call to action we would like to make is to invite all the stakeholders in this call to join us for a multi-stakeholder coalition that looks at digital inclusion, governments, investors, and civil society to rally around the benchmark findings and advocate for inclusive digitalization. And I end there with a note and saying that we are now live. So if you want to explore the findings to your heart's content, please visit the website. The links are also in the chat. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lourdes. And first of all, really congratulations. I know countless hours went into developing and shepherding the benchmark to this point. So really congratulations on today's launch. And this is such a rich report and such a rich benchmark. There's a tremendous amount to dig into. And I'm excited to do that with our really esteemed panel that we'll turn to now. We'll be discussing the benchmark's findings and how different actors plan to use the benchmark going forward. And we are just delighted to have such a brilliant lineup today from governments, from the private sector, and from the investor community. Before I introduce them, I just want to remind you all to please continue to use the chat function to ask questions and to reflect on the results and Lourdes' presentation and our conversation as it unfolds here. But now I'm very pleased to introduce our four panelists. You should have received their full and very impressive bios in an email earlier today. So I will just give the main highlights. First, we have Jeff Campbell, who is the Senior Vice President of Government Affairs and Public Policy at Cisco, which, as you saw, ranks 6th in the digital inclusion benchmark. At Cisco, Jeff oversees government affairs activities for the Americas, which is Cisco's largest geographic region, and he leads Cisco's policy agenda in the Western Hemisphere. In this role, Jeff is responsible for conferring with government and industry leaders to shape public policies that foster innovation and emerging digital technologies. Next, we have Dr. Albert Antwi-Bosiako, who is the National Cybersecurity Advisor for the Republic of Ghana. He's responsible for overseeing Ghana's cybersecurity development through the implementation of Ghana's national cybersecurity policy and strategy, which is being led by the Ministry of Communications. Dr. Antwi-Bosiako also spoke brilliantly on his personal experiences and reflections on digital inclusion and exclusion during our roundtable at the 75th UN General Assembly back in September. So we really appreciate him joining us again today. We're also joined by Michelle Maleki, who is the Global Head of Social Impact at HP, which ranked 8th in the digital inclusion benchmark, as you saw. She also leads strategy for HP Life, which is a program of the HP Foundation that provides free skills content for entrepreneurs, small business owners, and lifelong learners. And last but certainly not least, I'm very pleased to introduce David Cumming, Chief Investment Officer for Equities and Head of UK Equities at Aviva Investors. Aviva is also a founding member of the World Benchmarking Alliance, along with the UN Foundation and the Business and Sustainable Development Commission. So welcome to you all, and thank you all so much for joining us today. Let's dive into our discussion. And Jeff, I'd love to kick it off with a few questions in your direction. First, congratulations really on the ranking 6th in the digital inclusion benchmark. It's really impressive, and it's such a reflection of the priority of digital inclusion at Cisco. So I wanted to just ask you about that. Why is digital inclusion a key part of Cisco's corporate purpose?
Well, great. Thanks, Megan. And I'm really happy to be here today with so many people who are passionate about digital inclusion. And we're very proud to be on the list here today. I think at Cisco, our energy in digital inclusion comes back to the beginning of the company. I mean, Cisco developed the first multi-protocol router. This is why we have the internet today, and we've watched it grow through the years, and it's been a very important part of our mission. And just this year in this situation where we're facing global pandemic and so many challenges in the world, where technology and connectivity is what is allowing the world economy to continue and healthcare services to be delivered and so many other things. We as a company looked at how we look at this, and our long-term mission was always talked about changing the world, changing the way we live, work, play, and learn. But we actually thought it's time to move on to a new purpose as a company, to reflect where the world has come in the years and how much we've accomplished there, but how much more we have yet to do. And so we announced this year a new purpose for the company, which is to power an inclusive future for all. And we really mean this through technology, through people, and through everything that we do. It's not something a company can do, but it's something that companies and governments and academia can get together through partnerships to invest in these areas and really change the world in terms of underserved communities and how we get connectivity and digital opportunity out to everybody.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jeff. That's incredibly helpful, and just we'll ask a quick follow-up on that, and keeping your response in mind and knowing how inclusion is so central to Cisco's own work. And given that you are the highest ranked position of US headquartered companies, I wondered if you could comment a bit on digital inclusion in the US context.
Yeah, no, the US, it's interesting. So I've been at Cisco for 19 years now, and I was hired originally to work on how do we grow broadband connectivity in the United States, and have done many other things in the intervening years, but it's what's closest to my heart and what I've spent a long time working on, which is, I think in the US, we've gone beyond thinking about this as just a business and a private sector kind of activity to recognizing that it's a social responsibility for the whole country. And I think as we look forward to a new administration coming in the US and a bipartisan consensus in the Congress, that we really need to have universal connectivity here. So I think we're going to look at things like improving broadband connectivity in rural areas, which is an area where the US still has a lot of work to do. We also need to work very hard in making sure that all people have access to affordable broadband connectivity, particularly students in school and people who are trying to enter the workforce going forward. And so I think if we can get to a world where we can go beyond the 80-some% being connected to high quality broadband, to where we get to 99% of the world being connected, including throughout the US, both in rural areas and in underprivileged communities, we're going to make a whole lot of progress in this area. It's one area that Cisco's invested a lot in over the years in our Networking Academy program, which is a program that we offer free curriculum globally to educate people on how to become network operators, to create jobs and close the skills gap from old world conventional work to IT-oriented work. And we have worked hard in growing this program over the years that we've operated it to make sure that we're covering underserved populations, rural populations, people with disabilities, veterans. We're even offering programs in prisons so that when people return to society, they come back with skills. And, you know, over the years, we've educated over 11 million students in 180 countries with this, including just 2 million in the last year. And that's the kind of commitment that we want to offer as a company, to work with people to grow things both in the US but all around the world, so that we have a well-educated workforce with an infrastructure that's capable of supporting a digital economy.
That's great, Jeff. Thank you so much. And wow, 11 million students, 2 million in the last 2 years. That's so impressive. But thank you so much for sharing, you know, kind of your insights on how the evolution of digital inclusion and how we think about that in the US and Cisco's own, you know, evolving and growing work in this space. So thank you. I'd now like to turn to you, Dr. Albert. I mentioned in introducing you that you are the National Cybersecurity Advisor for Ghana, a country that is really at the forefront of a national digital transformation. So I'd like to pose the question to you: why is digital inclusion so important for Ghana?
Thank you once again for the opportunity, Megan, but also to my colleague panelists for making time to share their perspectives on those important subject matter. I think the findings are very revealing, and I'm quite excited that we have such data, you know, giving insight into the dynamics around you know, the role of tech firms as far as digital inclusion globally are concerned. I think it's very helpful, especially for us from the global south. It's very important, and I'm saying because there's a lot of work in progress activities going on, and there's opportunity that some of those revelations go into, you know, government interventions, policy formulations, advocacy, so on and so forth. But I think I would like to look at the ITU data globally. 2019, we have about a little over 4 billion people, representing about 53% of the world population being online. That's a global picture. I mean, let's look at the statistics on the African continent. That is less than 30% of the population. So, you know, that is quite below the projected figure by the ITU in terms of our online presence. So right from that angle, African population, you know, you can then look at the, if we call this digital inequality already, you know, this data gives that conclusion that already there is, you know, people on the African continent are at a disadvantage with respect to connectivity or the internet access. That is one case in point to look at it with respect to context. But let's also look at the COVID-19, which has also been one of the critical elements, giving us perspective into this subject matter. And I think here I have a very example to share with respect to some schools which are currently delivering courses online. I believe most of the Western countries, the US, for example, most of the classes will be delivered, you know, via virtual platforms. And I don't have the data all right, but, you know, I don't think less than 70% of American schools won't be able to cover virtual classes. But here, how many people on the African continent, in Ghana specifically, how many, you know, population of school-going age are able to connect digitally to study in view of COVID-19? That will be less than 10% of the total population of school-going age. That is another case in point in terms of the current situation, why some of this digital benchmarking, you know, digital inclusion benchmarking is quite important. So the question of what is the relevance of digital inclusion as far as a country like Ghana, and of course, speaking from the African perspective are concerned, I wouldn't want to deviate from the SDGs. because these are the key determinant factors that we need to look in building our analysis. If you look at goal number 4, quality education, if you look at goal number 8, which is economic growth, if you look at goal number 9, industry, innovation, infrastructure, but also goal number 10, reducing inequalities. I think these are all relevant SDG teams that are connected to how well, if you're able to advance digital inclusion initiatives, we'll be able to achieve some of this. So, for example, Ghana has introduced Girls in ICT as one of the flagship products, because there's the issue of gender digital divide is very important, and we've seen this, how many girls are actually in software engineering or even the computer science or in technology field in particular. So some of those interventions are being put in place, to help achieve the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Also, primarily, our president, Nana Dankwa Akufo-Addo, is actually a co-chair of advocates of the Sustainable Development Goals, and these are the elements that we feel is very necessary, in terms of a government developing country needing to put policies, initiatives in place to be able to achieve digital inclusion of that. I think we've also worked with Air Force, the Freedom Online Coalition, and together with Germany, Ghana launched a digital inclusion statement that sets some of those policy interventions for implementation to help address the digital gap. So we're talking of achieving a certain level of digital equality, and we believe digital inclusion is a way, of achieving digital equality in this particular case. But I think, Megan, you did mention that indeed. I'm actually, I have a story, and I've gone through this. So I'm not just talking about digital inclusion. I'm somebody, more like a product of what digital, access actually means. And a product means that I was able to personally have possibly the best form of education exposure, because of connectivity. I was able to, I was from one of the few homes at the time, possibly 5% of household that had access to computer and internet. And through that process, I was able to gain access to scholarship to study in Europe. There were a lot of brilliant people, hardworking, better than myself, but of course, they did not have this. It was a luxury at the time. I wouldn't want to go into the details as to how, I was able to compete with my brothers, to be able to use a computer and the internet to have that access. So I think for us, from also developing country perspective, digital inclusion is a right issue. It's a human right as well. It's not just only, a development imperative. I think it's also a right issue. And I've cited the example of having a lot of children unable to gain access to education. And if COVID-19 stays on for 2 years, it means the very people in the rural areas, in underserved, unserved communities wouldn't have access to anything. So I think that is something that we need to look at it. And I believe that the digital inclusion benchmark model is a good way of helping support governments in trying to address some of these issues. Megan, thank you. All right.
Thank you so much, Dr. Eller. You covered the question on digital inclusion from, it feels like, every level: the global, the continental, the national, and even the personal level and your personal experience and reflection. So thank you so much. And I just wanted to pull out a little bit further in a follow-up question on your last sentence, and to ask you to just expand a little bit more on how the WBA Digital Inclusion Benchmark can support your work and the government of Ghana's work to drive inclusive digital development, as you mentioned, in service of achieving the Sustainable Development Goals.
Megan, I think it's important. It's a good model, and I want to congratulate you, the team, for coming out with those innovative framework. And I see 2 levels of usage as far as their relevance to our development is concerned. One, I'm looking at based on the 4 parameters. We're talking of access, universal access. I mean, not just access, the skills development. We're talking of responsible usage. We're talking of innovation. I think these are the various areas that government can hold tech firms into account. Holding them to account means even constructive engagement. Government can also have constructive discussion with civil society groups, tech firms, just to make sure that, tech firms, are held account. We evaluate them. We also measure them, even if there are even tax incentive that needs to be given to them, some sort of recognition. We need to assess them based on those 4, metrics. That forms the heart of the benchmarking, model. So that is one way I see in terms of how my government, and I use the word developing country because a lot of work in progress mean there are policy interventions, there are legislation being drafted. There's a lot of engagement with tech firms, and this is an emerging area, the fintech industry. So I think that provides a very useful guide for government in my region. But I also want to look at the application of the model to the domestic context. It's very important. So the same model, how do we customize them to also assess how the domestic tech firms are doing around the same 4 areas that we're looking at. So I think it's quite good, and I believe we'll be looking forward possibly to pilot this in my country as a way of assessing also, the dynamics within the local context. Thank you.
That's wonderful, Dr. Abel, and I know Lourdes mentioned the real philosophy of WVA is to have not only all of the data, but also the methodology and all of the process behind developing the benchmark to be public and freely available for exactly this reason, to enable it to be picked up and used and shaped for specific context. So that's incredibly helpful, and I really liked your thinking on both of those levels. So thank you so much. I'll now turn to Michelle. Michelle, first, big congratulations on HP's high ranking on the benchmark. And I wanted to start by asking a question, related directly to that. Why does digital inclusion matter to HP?
Yeah, thank you for having me as a panelist and to the World Benchmarking Alliance for this incredible recognition. HP is a global technology company. We have solutions that are from our personal systems, which could very well be the device you're connecting through today. It could be the printers that we sell, as well as our 3D printing solutions. And so for us, thinking about what is the role of a global tech company when we talk about things like digital inclusion, and how do we not just solve or address or bridge, but really think about how do we tackle the digital divide with partners. It comes back to our corporate messaging around purpose. And I think this is what was clear in Jeff's remarks as well with Cisco is, we've heard it in the keynote remarks as well. There are no ways anymore that companies can just go out and hope to make a product and sell it. It's really about how do we think about our purpose and going beyond just selling a product. At HP, I'm fortunate to work on our sustainable impact team, which thinks about how we talk about our planet, our people, and the communities where we live, work, and do business. I come from the nonprofit world before joining HP, so this is an issue that's near and dear to my heart from what I saw in my experiences living and working overseas. And so for us, it's about we know what we can do and what we can do well. And I think we've launched a number of different programs, both during the time of this pandemic, but frankly, even before the pandemic started. And I look at the work that we've done in particular around education, which I know Dr. Albert was just hitting on very strongly. And as well, thinking about the pieces that come into this whole chain of what does a digital inclusion landscape look like. So whether that's the connectivity dimensions, where we would work closely with partners and see what makes sense so that our hardware can be used effectively and serve the right market. But then there's a third piece as well, which is thinking about the content. And I think what is that meaningful content that really drives these experiences and makes it from being just a digital access to a full inclusive experience. And so as a quick example, we have partnered, for example, with organizations like UN Women. We most recently this year launched a program with them in Mexico, where we have our free learning platform called HP Life, which is in multiple languages. It very much supports entrepreneurs, small business owners. And we said, we want to bring you this content, but we also want to make sure that it's working and meeting the women where they are and taking them where they want to go. So for example, it was an introduction to the content, but then there was also a key training piece involved. We made sure that as our technology was perhaps brought to these communities where the women were working, we had UN Women as well as other dedicated trainers ensuring they knew how to use the technology first and foremost, that they understood what were the different parameters and how they could create a learning pathway. And I feel like that's the heart of what we mean by purpose, what the word inclusion would really mean from a digital context. And then of course, for us, it allows us then to know what are we doing well? And this comes back to the pieces around metrics, around knowing what you're doing. What is the impact? And I think this all rolls under large corporate goals that HP has. For example, we're committed to enable better learning outcomes for 100 million people by 2025. And no surprise, of course, the work we do around this inclusive digital landscape is very much key to that, and it is on a global level.
That's great. Thank you so much, Michelle. And I think that your explanation was so helpful around how we think about purpose and then how you put that into practice, including through partnerships like the one you described with UN Women. You know, building on some of what you've talked about in terms of how we think about inclusion and how we put some of that into practice, what do you see as some of the major challenges or obstacles for digital inclusion, both for the sector, for the tech sector, but then also for society more broadly?
Sure. I mean, it's a great question because the reality is we know that we're not at a space right now, and we've heard this again from Dr. Albert and others. We know that not everyone everywhere is getting equal access to technology or internet connectivity or all of the pieces that make up a digital inclusion space. And so for us as a tech company, and we certainly are with many like-minded, wonderful partners in this, it's really understanding that there has to be some intentionality and we have to add specific lenses to ensure we do reach underrepresented communities, whether that's thinking about girls and women, which has been a hot topic for today and deservedly so, whether it's thinking about the work that we do to reach refugee and displaced populations around the world. And what does that even mean? And what will that look like for their experience? And so it's calling that out, owning it, committing to it, and then of course, finding that right ecosystem and group of partners that you know will help take your intentions as a company, but help drive them even further with purpose.
Great, thank you. And just one quick follow-up, but given, you know, HP's ranking in the benchmark, I'd love to hear from you, you know, how you think HP can use this leadership position in the benchmark and its work more broadly across inclusion to steer overall digital transformation toward a more inclusive digital economy and a more inclusive digital society.
Sure. I think this, you know, the report in the World Benchmarking Alliance has been incredibly helpful because it's allowed us to see, first of all, what's tracking? What are we doing well as a company with HP? Where are we able to also make further commitments? What are the things we can think about going forward? We know that, for example, when we think about the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and this being called the Decade for Action, how can we drive even further on the progress that we're making now? How do we think about what the 2030 vision will be and what our role is in that? And I think it's organizations and opportunities like this, as well as, frankly, these kinds of conversations that allow us to step back and have that critical moment that everyone appreciates these days in particular, to reflect, pause, and think about what could be done better, as well as where are we making real traction? And again, that's back to the metrics and assessment piece very nicely.
Thanks so much, Michelle. And yes, that the underlining the metrics and understanding where and how, you know, these efforts are having impact, so crucial. Thank you so much. So we've heard from leading voices and actors from government and from businesses that are really prioritizing digital inclusion. I'm now going to turn to David so that we can bring in an investor's perspective into this conversation. David, thank you so much for being here. To begin with, you know, I want to ask you if you can share your insights on the importance of digital inclusion and why is digital inclusion important to investors, and how can investors play a role in changing corporate attitudes and behavior? Sorry, long question.
I'll give you a long answer as well. So, but I think digital inclusion's a clear driver of companies' investment performance, and also positive social outcomes are becoming increasingly important to investors as well. So I'd make that point. I think before I go and sort of criticize digital companies, I think there have been positives. So positives around education, connectivity, commercial access. The COVID would have been a lot more difficult without being able to work remotely, shop online, etc. So there's a lot of positives, but it has become a necessary social utility. You could add it almost, digitalization, to the hierarchy of needs. And just to give one personal example, this struck me about 12 years ago when my son was in hospital with blood poisoning, and he was asked in the hospital, was there anything he wanted in the hospital? And he said, do you have Wi-Fi? So I think we've been around for a while. Digitalization's been important for a while, but with social utility comes responsibility. And I think CEOs, investors, customers know something is wrong at the moment. And some of this has been highlighted in your report, but particularly in the area of ethics. I mean, there are definitely suboptimal outcomes in the social media arena. Software companies, and you noted in your benchmark, are poor performers in this area, but things like reinforcing populist silos, fueling disharmony, diluting empathy, things around hate speech, you mentioned child protection, malicious information, racist algorithms of the past in terms of how they determine credit, etc. These are all human rights issues and social justice issues that have to be addressed. And a good thing about what you've done in terms of the scoring system, it helps us engage in that area. Now, and I do think investors and companies have to take the lead in resolving some of those issues. And I think maybe aggravated by digitalization, but we're at a point where consensus-driven politics is on the defensive, and ideological populism is on the ascendancy. And then, so we can't really always rely on government or regulation to intervene. So customers, investors, companies have to take the lead in these issues. And that includes things like inclusion, gender diversity, etc., as well as the ethics side. But I'm positive that this will happen based on logic. And I'll give you two reasons why I think this will occur. First, again, this is from an investment perspective, is investment risk. If digital companies fail to address negative social issues like ethics, gender inclusion, companies and their suppliers lose the trust of their customers and investors. They become disaffected. That impacts their reputation, that impacts the suppliers, it impacts their advertisers, and that impacts share prices, which, being blunt, is what we care about as well. So the persistence of negatives like hate speech or these factors, in addition, even with weak governments, can lead to regulation as well, which might be suboptimal for these businesses. So there's an investment risk, I think, that is definitely there that we will engage to address. But also a second driver, which has become increasingly important, is that investors now don't just look for financial performance. They're looking increasingly for positive social outcomes. The advent of the SDGs has been great in providing this. But companies that fail in this area will be increasingly targeted by investors, dropped or excluded from their portfolios if companies fail to respond to pursuing positive SDGs. That will affect their rating, their ability to get finance, etc. So both for outcomes and for investment risk reasons, I think people like us, investors, will engage for the better. And I think benchmarking companies like you've done will help facilitate that response and constructive engagement. And another thing I would highlight is that a lot more money is now flowing into funds. If you look at SDG and SEG companies, in terms of fund flows there have been very, very strong. So there's a drive from the investor who's seeing that and wants to monetize this purely on commercial reasons, who want to facilitate and respond to customers who want to invest with purpose. One final point I probably want to make is that companies who are on the line here mustn't underestimate the power of the investment community. Investors will engage and look to drive change in strategy at companies. They will remove executives who are resisting change or who are not acting in the wider interests of terms of communities. So we are in a position to enforce change. And I think some of the companies, a minority, particularly in social media companies, do have a degree of arrogance in terms of being untouchable. But the investment community, particularly if we work together, will get those companies, and that arrogance will not last. In general, arrogance tends not to be a successful business philosophy. So, if we look at what's happened to coal companies, oil companies, and the banks, investors can have quite a significant impact in terms of forcing action. So I would be optimistic about how we'll respond to your new benchmark in terms of positive outcomes. That was a long answer to your question.
I gave you a long question, so it's fair. But thank you so much for that. And just in a follow-up, I'd love to apply some of that, some of the roles that investors can play and some of the weights that they can bring to bear, to the benchmark, and how do you respond to the results and key findings, and what do you see as concrete next steps for investors taking this forward?
Well, I think the benchmark allows us to facilitate holding companies to account. It highlights issues that we need to deal with. It provides a focus for positive corporate engagement and challenge. So it provides a framework which I think is useful. And I think companies themselves can look at this and say, look, this is what we're not doing so well. It's very visible. It will have an impact on how companies perform in ratings. It's a trusted source. The data's solid. So I think it will help facilitate engagement. It will help, I think, companies respond and put them under more pressure to respond. So that's a positive. So we're very supportive. In summary, I'd say digitalization is a good thing, but it has responsibilities. Companies have to address some of these issues, and they mustn't resist, because their business models will come under pressure and be challenged by investors if they do resist. And resistance is going to be more difficult with benchmarks like this. So it's a positive.
Great, wonderful. Well, thank you so much. And this actually wraps up our panel, and I think on a really forward-looking note about how, in a very practical sense, how investors can be using the results that Lourdes and WBA have unveiled today. I want to thank all of our panelists. This has been an incredible group to offer their insights into both the importance of digital inclusion and how WBA's new benchmark can be used to accelerate all of our work toward a more inclusive digital future. We are nearing the end of our time here today, but I wanted to come back quickly to Lourdes to reflect on what she heard in the panel's discussion and to offer any final thoughts or next steps. So Lourdes, over to you, please.
Thanks, Megan. I'll just wrap it up very quickly. So I neglected to congratulate our two members of the panel, Cisco and HP, for doing an excellent work on digital inclusion, as we found through our rigorous research process. So congratulations to you both. And we hope that you continue the good work, and not just within your own company, but that you go out there and be the change we want to see in the digital world. Because it's not enough for a few companies to be really doing more than their fair share. We have to try to encourage the rest of the digital sector to actually also do their fair share. So congratulations, and we expect great things from you in the future. There will be a second round for the benchmark in 2021, and the world's eyes will be on the progress of the different companies in the benchmark. And we're hoping to see a lot of progress from the software and IT service companies, both in the way they engage with the World Benchmarking Alliance work on digital inclusion, as well as on digital inclusion as a core responsibility. And we hope to see their scores and performance also improve. So that's a challenge that we throw out there. And to investors as well, David, very happy to have you on board. In case most other people are not familiar with David, he's the Chief Investment Officer for Equities at Aviva Investors. So he's really in a position, I hope, to move capital, a very powerful position. So coming from him, that's a lot of support. So we're very happy, and we're very excited to see the investors on board. So we're definitely looking forward to 2021, and of course to our UN partners at the Digital Cooperation Team, the United Nations Foundation. Thank you very much, Dr. Albert, for joining us again. And we hope everyone looks at the results. It's now live online. Share, tweet, use the hashtags DIB 2020. Thanks.
Great. Thank you so much, Lourdes. I won't try to sum up. Lourdes did such a wonderful job, so I won't try to repeat what she said, but just want to underscore that we at UNF are looking forward to continuing our close partnership with the World Benchmarking Alliance and working with all of you here on the call today toward an inclusive digital transformation. Thank you so much again for joining us, and please have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.